Understanding emotional triggers and their relevance to relationships and the interpersonal dynamics at play is crucial if we want to thrive in relationships. Here are 7 new terms I've coined to help you get to grips with exactly what's going on when someone gets emotionally triggered, plus an explanation of what triggers are, what causes them, and how to deal with them. So let's start with an explanation of what triggers are. First of all, triggers emanate and they originate from the past, something that's happened to us and has had an effect on us, more than likely to shut us down, both mentally in our psychology and also physically in our nervous system, in our physiology. And we can be reminded of them or their limiting effect on us by anything that we experience, basically. It could be one of the 5 senses, or it could be a thought. So you might be triggered by the smell of someone's aftershave, or some alcoholic drink that somebody once drank that reminds you of something, or maybe some clothes people wear. Some people's appearance may trigger you. The names of places may trigger you. Anything to do with any sense, or what other senses might there be? So smells, they can trigger you. Sounds can trigger you, and situations can trigger you. If someone is good with money but bad with relationships, then any situation that relates to relationships will more than likely trigger them and put them in a state where they're not feeling confident and they're not sure how to be. So they go from, as we say in Kissing Consciousness, go from being unself-conscious to being self-conscious. These are 2 examples of the difference between love consciousness and fear consciousness. What we need to remember, though, is that being triggered by someone isn't inherently intentionally abusive. If I can be triggered by somebody who might just happen to have white hair, because I had a horrible experience once meeting somebody who had white hair, I can't necessarily blame that other person for being like that. So we have to understand that triggers are, by and large, unless they're done intentionally, then they're incidental, and it's on us to kind of respond to how we deal with that. So before we get on to how to deal with triggers, let's go through the 7 trigger dynamics that I said I coined. And these came about because I realized I was getting blamed. People were blaming me for things that triggered them, which didn't feel good. So I wanted to find out exactly what was going on. So I observed the situation and various dynamics that were happening, and came up with these 7 trigger dynamics for Kissing Consciousness. So let's go through them all then. The first one is trigger apologizing. And as I say, that's what I was doing. Somebody else was being triggered and giving me the blame for their emotional reaction and how they felt about it and all that kind of stuff. And I was saying, oh, sorry about that. I'm obviously doing something wrong. But I wasn't doing something wrong, so I shouldn't have been apologizing. And so that's the first thing we need to recognize, is that when we trigger somebody else, there's nothing inherently negative or bad or badly intentioned that we're doing. It's just something that happens to be the case. So we shouldn't really be having to apologize just for being us. So that's the first one. And let's take a reading from the Kissing Consciousness Handbook, page 377. In the past, I had people come up to me and tell me I made them uncomfortable because I jumped around too energetically, for example. In my ignorance, I made myself wrong for that. I told myself I was wrong, often apologizing, and certainly constricting my natural self-expression as a result. But this is not conscious. I should not have to apologize for this, so I call this trigger apologizing. And we can also do a clearing to go along with that. So anywhere where you've made yourself lesser or smaller in order to be acceptable to the people around you, would you like to let that go? And if so, would you like to ask your body if it would like to let that go? That's a great clearing. The second trigger dynamic is trigger communicating. And this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Typically, communication is a good thing. So anytime we get triggered by something, maybe somebody triggered by something that somebody else does or says, if it's innocently intentioned on their part, then it's perfectly reasonable. We might want to communicate that to them and just say, hey, just so that you know, what you're doing or what you said there triggers me. Now, we don't have to necessarily make them wrong for that, but we can simply communicate the fact that that's the case. So let's take a reading from the Kissing Consciousness Handbook on that then. It's fine for a person to tell another person that something they do triggers them, i.e. trigger communicating, as long as they're only informing them. As part of that, they may even also let the other person know that they can't or don't wish to interact with them because of it. If we do choose to trigger communicate, it might sound something like this. Hi, just to let you know that when you do or say that thing, it triggers me. It makes me feel, insert as appropriate, e.g. uncomfortable, scared or unloved. Of course it's my responsibility. I just thought I'd make you aware of it, that it was having this effect on me. Or use your own words to that effect, depending on exactly what you want to say. So the third trigger dynamic is requesting trigger stopping. So if you imagine that you're in a situation where something that somebody else does is triggering you, and you might then decide that it's appropriate to ask them if they'll stop doing that thing. For example, right now I have a neighbour who's using an electric saw to cut trees down, and I'd quite like to go and ask them to stop that because it's interrupting my recording. But I won't do that. I've decided against that. But also, so this is the dynamic here, whereby it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but depending on the context, to ask somebody to stop doing something that triggers them. 20 years ago, I was in a relationship where, in a situation where I was referencing a fictional character from television, and it was, what's the word I would use? It was upsetting my girlfriend. She didn't like it. And after a while, I realized that she was serious. She genuinely didn't like it, and she was making it clear. So it's, yeah, absolutely fine. When I realized it's okay, I'll stop making reference to that character if it's not welcome. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Of course, everything's contextual, and as always, your state of your consciousness is primary. Whether you're in a state of love consciousness or fear consciousness, it's not impossible that you get into a state where it's not the right thing to do to request someone stops, but perhaps you get into self-judgment and fear consciousness. You think perhaps you should, conditional tense again. So it's not a given that you're always going to be taking a conscious act, but it's perfectly reasonable thing to do in some contexts. The triggered person may even ask, without any expectation or sense of a right to demand, if the other person is willing to modify their behaviour. They have that choice to ask that if they wish, and of course, the other person has their choice as to how they wish to respond to the request. If they're a reasonable person, they will likely at least bear it in mind, if not simply decide it's no downside to them to simply not doing the thing. But they're not obliged to. That's the point. Asking someone if they will modify their behaviour could either be conscious or an unconscious act if driven by our neediness. The fourth trigger dynamic is trigger dumping, and this is where we get into the meat and drink of the whole thing. This is where people are being triggered and they're blaming you, they're having a go at you for the emotional reaction or the fear reaction or whatever it is that they're experiencing as a result. And of course we have to look at this the other way around. There are going to be times when it's us doing it as well if we don't realize what we're doing, if we're not conscious to our own drives and motives. And even if we are, we're not perfect, so we're going to have those moments where we're trigger dumping on other people and blaming them or getting tetchy with them, whatever it might be. So that's the essence of it, and it's important to realize, as I say, that we don't really have the right to have a negative response or reaction to somebody else who's innocently triggering us if it's just something that happens to be that they're not doing particularly deliberately. It's just a matter of fact of life. Some clothing that they're wearing, some words that they say, could be anything, but if it's innocent, we don't really have the right to have a go at them for that. So the onus is on the person being triggered then to recognize that that's happening and not dump on other people, basically. Take responsibility. We'll come on to that in a moment. Here's page 378. Going beyond communicating or making a request to blaming the other person for triggering us or expecting them to change their behaviour is what I call trigger dumping. It is not respectful and does not take responsibility, and so is not conscious. If you are tempted to do this to another person, the answer, as always, is to release any self-judgments. In fact, after I explained the definition of the term, my friend realised it happened with a friend of hers earlier that day, remarking she totally just trigger dumped on me. Trigger dumping is also an example of control and abuse consciousness, since it occurs when somebody who is unwilling to take responsibility for their own reactions seeks to force someone else to do so or stop doing something innocent. So leading on quite naturally from that, the fifth trigger dynamic is declining trigger dumping. Somebody attempts to dump their emotional response or reaction onto us, and we decline that. We decide that we're not having it. And then you can see also that obviously brings into play a whole world of potential and possibilities about how we might choose to do that. We might do it unconsciously if we also react, and we do it without being in control of how we want to deal with the situation, or we might do it consciously and respond rather than react. But either way, we're making it clear that we're not going to have a part of their situation, their reaction. So it's nothing to do with us, and we're, rather than apologising and saying, "Oh, okay, it's our fault." No, it's not our fault. This is on you. So that's declining trigger dumping. This is what we do when people try to dump blame or criticism for their triggers onto us, and we're not having any of that. The phrase "not my circus, not my monkeys" comes to mind. We don't need to get involved in other people's shadow baggage. The act of declining itself could also be either conscious or unconscious. An unconscious reaction might be as rude as "get lost," whereas a more respectful, helpful response might be to point out what's happening and who is responsible for the person's reaction to the trigger. The sixth trigger dynamic is something that's definitely conscious, and that's trigger owning. So we recognize that we're being triggered and we own it. We take responsibility for the fact that it's happened, for the fact that even if it's come from some other person's words or actions, it's perfectly innocently meant, and it's our responsibility because we're the ones having the emotional response. It's actually nothing to do with them. So we need to own the fact that it's on us to take responsibility for how we deal with it. And we're already partly into that. You're still watching this video, so you're obviously interested in the topic and you're aware of these dynamics and the importance of taking responsibility, taking a conscious response and approach to what's going on. So this kind of covers the part of how we deal with triggers. We hold presence to them. We, by virtue of the fact that we're talking about them, we're getting used to the idea that they happen and recognizing them as a dynamic in society. So we're already building that ability to understand what's happening. And the more we practice it, the more we'll get better at it. We get triggered, we go, whatever it is, but then we notice ourselves, okay, that's just happened. How do I want to deal with this? And that's how we own our triggers. The good news about a trigger bringing a self-judgment to the surface of experience is that if we are indeed aware, we can catch it, i.e. observe it, and process it. By acknowledging our responsibility for our own unconscious reaction to the innocent event that triggered us, we are trigger owning. And of course, we can also use the kissing consciousness tool here. Anytime we notice a self-judgment or self-constriction is affecting us, we can use the tool. First question is, would you like to let that go? Or if you're asking yourself, you can think to yourself, would I like to let that go? And second question, if so, would you like to ask your body if it would like to let that go? So if you get triggered and you notice it, you can ask yourself, you say to yourself, okay, would I like to let that go? And yes, I would. And would I like to ask my body, would you like to let that go? And bodies typically always want to let go of constrictions and reactions because they like a relaxed natural state. So you can ask the body if it would like to let it go. Yes, please. Thank you very much. And so, of course, that's trigger releasing. Now we're talking. If we choose to, we can let go of the energy of the self-judgment that caused the reaction in us, which is trigger releasing, of course. The sad side of being triggered is when people don't realize what's going on and put up with the restrictive effects. They suffer in silence, which we might call trigger suffering. As we know, there's no need for someone to keep hold of a self-constriction that triggers them. So there we have it. Trigger apologizing, trigger communicating, requesting trigger stopping, trigger dumping, declining trigger dumping, trigger owning, and trigger releasing. And so we can also see table 7.1 of the handbook, the Kissing Consciousness Trigger Dynamics. Trigger owning is conscious, it's taking responsibility for what triggers you. Trigger dumping is unconscious, it's blaming others for what triggers you. Trigger apologizing is unconscious, it's allowing others to blame you for what triggers them. Declining trigger dumping is conscious, it's not allowing others to blame you for what triggers them. Trigger communicating may or may not be conscious. It may be conscious or it may be unconscious, and it's respectfully letting someone know that what they do triggers us. The reason it may be unconscious is because it might not necessarily be what you want to do in that moment, and you might do it as a result of self-judgment. Requesting trigger stopping is also conscious or unconscious, and it's asking someone if they would consider stopping doing something that triggers us. And finally, optionally, trigger releasing is conscious and is letting go of the self-judgment that causes an innocent event to trigger us. And finally, as an extra insight, I'd like to share with you something called third-party trigger dumping, which is particularly something that's close to my heart because it was something I experienced for years as a child growing up. And that is when people blame us or they dump on us for something that somebody else did that triggered them. What on earth would third-party trigger dumping look like? Well, if a mother was frustrated that her husband was very late back and she wanted to involve the kids in the drama, she might say to them, "Where's your father got to?" A person in this situation who wanted to take responsibility is more likely to word it, "Where's my husband got to?" But it's your father, you see, so you're to blame. You're now involved in the saga, even though you did nothing. That's third-party trigger dumping. Maybe a guy gets ribbed by one of his mates about his girlfriend and it presses his buttons. It makes him feel embarrassed, so he goes home and criticizes his girlfriend. That's third-party trigger dumping. So there we have it then, a complete rundown of the dynamics involved in relationships and emotional triggers. And if you'd like my help with that, I may be able to help you on a one-to-one basis. If that's something that's of interest to you, you can find out more about that at kissingconsciousness.com/coaching. And I'd also like to offer you the first 2 chapters of the Kissing Consciousness Handbook absolutely free. That's going to help you get into things such as the power of love and how you can feel both love consciousness and fear consciousness in your body. And of course, it's going to be the basics of how Kissing Consciousness works, help you with some of the stuff that we've covered today as well. If you'd like that, you can get that for free at kissingconsciousness.com/chapters. I'd love to hear from you, as I say, if you want to put any comments below, and good luck with that. I'll see you again.